Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
You ever heard of George Pickett? He was a general.
Hi guys, why Japan surrendered, potential history, great channel, preemptive like, let's do it.
Perfume enthusiast.
My name's Connor, by the way, hi. Original link to the video, top description, below that, Discord, go.
Ever heard of George Pickett? He was a general, perfume enthusiast, war criminal, and person in the wrong place at the wrong time, ordered to carry out the disastrous charge that would forever have his name attached to it at Gettysburg. Post-war, there was a fascination in the US over the defeat there. And, as you can imagine, Pickett was often asked what he thought was the cause of this huge defeat. But whenever asked, his reply was always the same. I think the Yankees had something to do with it.
Not a bad answer.
Let's talk about Japan.
Okay.
So if you know one thing about the Japanese in World War II, it's their reputation to not give up. From the individual, to the unit, to the government, holding out and preferring death to giving up. So it's kind of weird they gave up, right? Like, really, you could make an argument Germany held out longer and more in line with the stereotypical Japanese warrior spirit than Japan itself did. Japan even got like a...
Well, Japan didn't get a chance to defend it. Okay, sorry,
more in line with the stereotypical Japanese warrior spirit than Japan itself did. Japan even got like a semi-conditional surrender and peacefully welcomed an occupation. Whereas Germany... So how did that happen? And that question, for some reason, has become this huge point of debate recently. Well, more like a year ago, but this is when I'm getting to it. And it's very dumb because it's turned into this monocausal debate of the true cause of Japan's surrender. But here we go. So there are two arguments. Most people believe that it was the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs that scared Japan into surrendering. That is this camp's be-all, end-all point, given that on August 6th, one was dropped, showing Japan that the US had the capability, with the second dropped on the 9th, confirming that it wasn't some kind of one-off thing, and inferring that it could literally be done until there was no one left.
I think it was sort of like a checkmate thing, like the Americans have the capability of dropping these bombs that we can't stop, that will literally destroy the emperor and everyone in the royal family if it hits a target. And so...
Or they gave up. You know, simple cause and effect.
Bomb was finally released exactly at the designated hour, and the explosion occurred as planned.
The other big one is that Soviet intervention caused Japan's surrender.
Hokkaido.
The story from that point of view goes, a bomb is dropped August 6th, Japan doesn't respond and doesn't care, but on August 9th, the Red Army invades Manchuria, and then the Japanese surrender, and they just kind of ignore the other bomb. Now, I'm gonna let you in on a secret. Both these takes are dumb. Seriously, whenever people discuss the surrender of Japan and make their case, it always involves the most flagrant use of cherry-picking I have ever seen and ignoring certain facts. And I'm not even including all the counterfactuals when you expand the conversation to the morality of all of it, which, to be extremely clear, is not what this video is about. This is a whole different conversation. We are just talking about what got Japan to quit.
Is that the skull of Tojo?
Not going into that. I mean, maybe one day if you ask nice enough. Now, for all of this to become super clear, all you need is a timeline of events and to work out how they interact with each other, while not leaving any of them out. By mid-1945, everybody in Japan knew how bad the situation was. Absolutely no one held out any hope for what could be called a victory in the traditional sense of the word. There are no Steiner's counterattacks here. This is Japan.
Samurai, there are no hoes here. This is Japan in 1945. You are going to die.
Japan in 1945, you are going to die. One thing often missed when talking about this was...
That's so badass, dude.
1945, you are going to die. One thing...
How they, like, the person in front would run out with a samurai sword just to kind of, like, rally everyone behind them.
Often missed when talking about this was, at this point, that kind of victory wasn't the goal. The goal was really, at this point, just a negotiated peace to avoid utter defeat. and their plan for this was called Ketsugo. The general idea for it was to bleed the Americans until they gave up. Now, this is not far off from what the Japanese had hoped to do pretty much the entire war. They were always realistic about the fact that as long as morale held, they were going to get trounced by the United States. But what began as a hope for an anti-war sentiment after Pearl Harbor was now taking its final form here at the end, with now trying to take as many Americans with them as possible and hope there's some Japan left by the time they give up. And this plan was going to be enacted during the American invasion of Japan they knew was coming. These policies were enacted by a council called the Big Six, made up of 4 Navy, 2 Army, and 1 civilian member that had to agree unanimously on all decisions for the nation. And they were very, very united in this policy.
This guy looks angry. Super fanatic, I'm guessing?
All of this is to say that Japan wasn't just preparing for an invasion, they were hoping for it. It was the goal. They wanted the Americans to come to them and make Okinawa look like a joke, so that those weak-willed Americans would leave them alone. And Japan, although technically defeated in pretty much all its war aims, would still keep its institutions, government, and not be occupied. And until August of 1945, to the Japanese, it looked like that was going to pretty much have to play itself out. But then in the course of
Guys, I've never been in war. I've never been in the army. I've never been in ROTC. Nothing, okay? But I've seen videos like on History Channel or Military Channel of like, you know, all the World War II documentaries that are so cool to watch, and I've watched so many of them enjoyably. Is that it? I'm talking too much. If I'm a soldier and I'm landing and I'm seeing an enemy, nothing would scare me more than a young mother with her kid jumping off a cliff to her death to like avoid dishonor, to avoid any propaganda they thought, you know, the Americans would do to them or whatever. Like, to me, that would be so much more mentally distraughtful to me than seeing like 10 men just blow each themselves up with a grenade. Because like, if a young mother is willing to just so easy, and it looked like she was just walking like off just into like some water or something. Like, she didn't even hesitate. That was the scariest thing. She was just like, oh, here's a cliff, jump. And that would terrify me, because I'm like, if she is willing to do that, a young woman with a child, then everyone is probably going to be that insane. And probably people like young men are going to be even more insane. And that would be so demoralizing.
it looked like that was going to pretty much have to play itself out. But then in the course of less than a week, all of that changed. On August 6, 1945, Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima and destroyed it. But surprisingly, for being the first people to have the literal power of the sun harnessed against them, the Japanese response was actually pretty muted. The Big Six and the government were not really impressed at all. Japan had a nuclear program during World War II. Although it wasn't successful, it gave them a really good idea of how Herculean a task it was to create one of these things. And so for those who actually believed it was a nuclear device, they figured there was no way there could be more than one. The Army and Navy's opinions were even more extreme, with the Army flat out denying that it was a nuclear weapon, demanding more evidence, and the Navy essentially saying, "That's neat. Do it 5 more times and I might be scared." And as far as official responses from the Japanese government, there was nothing. Fast forward to 3 days later, the Red Army invades Manchuria with fantastic success, essentially rolling over the Kwangtung Army and its allies. As you can imagine, this was not ideal. Japan had been doing everything it could to not provoke the Soviet Union this entire war.
How do the Soviets have a seemingly an unlimited amount of men to throw into war? It's like, oh, just lost like 20 million people fighting Germany. They're gone. All right, you guys go over to Manchuria now, on the other side of the freaking world.
War after 1939. And people in the Japanese government had actually been really hoping that the USSR might be convinced to mediate peace talks between they and the US. Peace talks with terms the US would never accept, but nonetheless. But although they were now fighting large country number 4 at this point, there was still no move to action from the government. Although they were now fighting large country number 4 at this point, there was still no move to action from the government. Upon hearing the news, Army Chief of Staff this guy pretty much dismissed it out of hand, saying that, yes, this is an unwelcome development, But this does not invalidate Ketsugo, essentially saying, hey, if the Soviets want to land too, it's all killing allies to me. Then, no kidding, about 10 hours after the Soviet invasion begins,
China?
another bomb is dropped on Nagasaki, destroying it. But even then still, on the 9th, the Big Six cannot come to a unanimous decision for what to do.
Didn't they only have, like, 3 ready? Like, so didn't they really only have 3 bombs that were, like, ready for deployment at a moment's notice, including the 2 that they used? So did I hear this correctly, that, like, they only had 1 bomb ready? And if Japan knew that, then they might stick out a bit longer. But obviously they could make more bombs, but it's not like you're pumping out, guns or something.
It takes until the next day, August 10th, that an imperial conference is called and Hirohito makes the decision to surrender, breaking a 3-3 tie on what to do. Now, this is normally where the retelling ends, but this leaves the situation far from sorted, as maybe the government decided to surrender, but what about the army? In fact, this whole war started because the army wasn't listening to the government in 1933. There's absolutely no guarantee that they're going to go along with this. In fact, right after the decision, General Kawabe's deputy chief of staff was asked by another senior general, what if the officers don't follow the order? To which he said without hesitation in his diary, yeah, a lot of them probably won't. And after that, just like he predicted, 2 of the 3 Japanese area army commanders, one in China and one in Southeast Asia, declared that they would not stop fighting. On top of this, there was actually a coup by a bunch of middle-ranking officers to steal the surrender declaration recording Hirohito made, and probably to kill pro-peace government figures and possibly even try to take control of the emperor himself. Now, the whole thing was horribly planned and had no chance of success, but it goes to show that the government saying, we give up, is not the end of the story. Skipping ahead, but it goes to
Why does this guy scare me? He just looks scary.
The government saying, we give up, is not the end of the story. Skipping ahead, on August 15th, Hirohito's surrender declaration is played to the Japanese people. Now, it mentions only the atomic bombings and not the invasion of Manchuria by the Soviet Union. This has been used by those who argue the bombs solely ended the war as evidence for the fact that the Soviet Union played no part. But it makes sense why he would only mention this to the Japanese people, who both had a frame of reference for it and were being affected by it. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria would have meant nothing to them, and would not have made any sense as a reason to surrender, being something that was far off on the mainland. The opposite was the case everywhere else, though. Although Japan had officially surrendered, the army just flat out refused to stop fighting the Soviets in many sectors.
Can I say something? I think, this is my opinion, I'm no expert, I think you can change my mind. It was the bombs. It was not the Russian invasion. Because the bombs meant, like, the Russian invasion and American invasion meant that, yeah, you're likely going to go, but in order to reach the emperor, they have to go through the entire Japanese population. And once, like, there is with no doubt that Americans have this weapon that they can just drop with complete air superiority, air superiority, because, pretty much no Japanese planes to shoot down the planes carrying the bombs. And that means they don't have to go through all of the fanatical Japanese soldiers and civilians. They just have they don't know how many of the bombs they have. They just have to bomb a bunch of areas that might not wipe out the entire Japanese imperial family, which I'm sure was unbearable to think of. And I'm sure that's like, hey, we're surrendering. They have this weapon that they can just keep dropping on us. Not to mention, like, all of the napalm firebombings of, I'm not sure if they had napalm in World War II. I think they might have. No, I think they did. Like the Tokyo firebombings. And it's just like the atomic bomb was, I'm assuming, was just all right. The emperor's like, all right, there is no doubt they have these things. They just kill entire cities, which means they can drop a bunch on Tokyo, imperial areas, and everything is dead, which would be even worse than surrendering and keeping everything somewhat intact.
This, as you can imagine, would be a political nightmare, and could only go on for so long until your enemies just no longer believe that you're actually trying to surrender and start thinking that this was probably just some trick to buy time. So on August 17th...
That happens a lot, actually. Good point. I hear that a lot in history videos. Like, surrender talkings are sometimes just buy a bit more time.
And start thinking that this was probably just some trick to buy time. So on August 17th, a shorter speech by Hirohito was given to call the military itself to surrender. And although the tone of both speeches are very similar, the call to action is over the Soviet intervention, with the bombs not being mentioned at all. But this also makes a lot of sense because it is directed at people who aren't in Japan and are bearing the brunt of fighting all these enemies abroad. To the individual commanders, hearing about Hiroshima and Nagasaki would have been an incredible non-issue given two things.
But they're killing your cities and industry. How would you not care about that?
One, cities have been destroyed before. This was another firebombing of Tokyo by a different name. They had to be thinking, we were fine with that when it happened. How is this any different? And they also have no concept of what an atomic bomb even is. So the magnitude of the event was just lost on them. And two, Japan had already decided to fight this thing out till the end and rule over what was left. Since they were doing exactly that in the occupied territories, they 100% expected people to be doing that on the home islands. Mentioning the Soviet invasion implied that they couldn't really bleed the enemy to a stalemate anymore, with a whole nother country arrayed against them. That kind of line of thinking utterly invalidates Ketsugo, and was really the only thing that would convince them to lay down their arms. Basically, at this point, there's so much against us, this stalemate, or this forcing the enemy to give up, just isn't possible anymore. You really see all of this play out post-war in memoirs for both points of view. Generals abroad always say the surrender came from the Soviet intervention. Governmental figures, and those on the home islands, will say it was the bombs. And that gets to my point. There's no singular reason for Japan's surrender.
Okay, but if you were to take out the bomb and keep in the Soviet invasion, I think it would be less likely for them to surrender than if you took away the Soviet invasion but still had the bomb. Now, that doesn't go with, I agree with him that there are many different things, and it's not just like a one answer, but I think that the bomb would have a much bigger effect than another country invading, because they have to go through your defenses.
In the course of 3 days, just 3 days, things went from a terrible situation with basically a national suicide pact to the sky falling, both figuratively and literally, depending on where you were. And even after that, there were still significant holdouts. History is the study of cause and effect, but I think that people often want to make that a lot cleaner than it actually is. No event takes place for a singular reason, especially one as messy as this. So if I had to say why the Japanese surrendered in 1945, I think the Allies had something to do with it.
Thanks. I think you just said that right off the bat. Great video. Potential history is awesome. Oh, post-emptive like. Should have been preemptive. I enjoyed that, guys. Let me know your thoughts and about my opinions and answer any questions I might have had. Hope you're all doing well. If not, love y'all. Look at me. Love you. Chin up. You'll be good soon. Don't worry. Emotions are fickle, my friend. Bye, guys.